again.
Hello, my old friend, Bill.
Hello, Sandi and Sandi's knee.
It's really hot here.
I'm not giving you any guff about it. I understand it's very hot here as well.
So this evening, we haven't actually spoken for a couple of weeks. So we've had a break. We've come back and you're in charge tonight. You have been the person who's provided the images and the idea. Although, of course, I've done all the hard work, putting things on PowerPoint and all that stuff, finding out what's what.
So you've done research, haven't you?
Well, wide walls. I knew about the murals we're going to look at, and I know the artist. But I don't know what you know because I've never seen these things in real life where you have.
Yeah. We'll jump into it and then I didn't actually know that these existed until I saw them. And I kind of feel dumb for not knowing that.
What do you mean you didn't know they existed?
Well, I mean, I didn't go to that museum to see these, where had I known, I would have gone to this museum to see these.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yep. So for people watching, looking, don't know what this is, these are murals by the great Mexican painter Diego Rivera.
Yeah.
Painted 1932, it started until 1933. There are 27 panels.
Right in the middle of the Great Depression.
Yeah, so a very interesting time to be painting. They are in Detroit.
Yeah,
so
at the Detroit Institute of Art.
Yeah, so you were recently there and you saw them.
I was, and it was one of those, oh yes, and don't miss over there in that other room are the famous Diego Rivera murals. And I was like, oh, okay, let's go check out these murals. And you walk in this room, and as you can see in the picture on the screen, they're quite big. And it's also one of those rooms where, even though there are multiple walls involved in this, but the walls aren't quite far enough away from each other to see the top segments, the top frames really well. Does that make sense? You're always looking up at them. You're not looking across at them. Like you would need scaffolding to really get a good idea of them.
I mean, is that deliberate? Is there an intention, do you think, to there being this sense of having to crane one's neck?
I think it was probably just, this is the room that he was asked to paint. The place already existed. These are the frames in the wall where it made sense to do this. It's just sort of, I think it was an element of the site rather than a specific idea. But of course, the things at the top are bigger and simpler. So
yeah, they're
obviously, they're scaled accordingly. It's also so interesting when you think about even just like a, sister fresco being even the Sistine ceiling or something, how Michelangelo used the framing of the ceiling in order to make panels that way, some of which were actually there and some of which I think he turned into all of that stuff. It's interesting to look at it here because he was obviously painting in an area that already existed. And it's so interesting because you could imagine people in 1929, if this was just standard sort of stone walls in this room, and then you're having some Mexican socialist come in here and paint.
Well, I want to mention that we're going to look at details of this in a minute, but again, for people listening, thinking about Diego Rivera, I've said, the great Mexican painter. He really is the great Mexican painter. I mean, he's the artist who commands the highest figures at auction, even ahead of Frida Kahlo, who, by the way, was his wife twice. That's something that probably will come up when we're talking later about some of the details in this. But he was a really odd choice at this point in American history to be the person who was tasked with painting these grand murals, because at the time, Detroit, although it was the Great Depression, was also the lead outputter, manufacturing industry, automotive industry. It was boomtown, really.
Yep. Which is why the Detroit Institute of Art is even there, right? Is because of all this kind of stuff going on.
Yes, but to have somebody who essentially is a Marxist thinker, who consorts with, Trotsky, and is very much on the fringe of a very socialistic, though not necessarily liberal lifestyle or other people.
Making murals that a lot of people see as glorifying capitalism.
Yeah.
Where he could argue that he was glorifying the workers in capitalism.
Yeah. Yes.
And part of the reason why I brought this up, why I wanted to do these in the first place, was just the 12 different ways you could analyze this depending on what your political or your own mental leanings are.
Yeah. And I think, these images, they're PhD fodder or dissertation fodder for lots of art students, because there are multiple readings. There's lots of political codes and codifications in these symbols. Also, Rivera, himself was like a walking legacy of a mixture, a collision of cultures. And that kind of is then outputted into this work. So, by all accounts, he was a most irascible human. He had a very volatile relationship with Frida, for example. I think possibly they were equally as difficult for each other. But he was violent. He had a violent temper. He wasn't a particularly pleasant man.
He was sleeping around with everything that moved. And interestingly enough, not a particularly good-looking guy. So I don't know how he was getting all these women to go to bed with him. Well, I mean, every other minute he was with some other woman,
Yeah, hugely charismatic by all accounts. And well-traveled, had lived in Montmartre, had been in Paris. Again, let's think about Mexico for a second as quite a perhaps isolated country in many ways. So for someone to have the wherewithal or even the money to come out and go to Europe was actually quite unusual. But
it seems as though from his biography that I've read that he had benefactors and mentors who sent him to Europe to study and that kind of stuff because he was talented.
Yeah, he was. And actually his parents even really supported him in his artistic career, even as a young child, by all accounts. He started drawing on walls and things like that when he was very young. And his parents both were delighted and bought him canvases and enabled him to be what he is, what he was. Again, maybe quite an unusual upbringing. And there's lots of other things we could say. I mean, anybody can just go and read the Wikipedia page about Rivera. He's very accessible in terms of being written about. But he did say that he felt his mother was a converso. So her family, the ancestry was Jewish, but they'd been forcibly converted to Christianity in the sort of 16th century, I think.
Although he himself was an atheist.
He was an atheist, but he was very identified with Judaism. And he actually said something like, it enabled him to appreciate and empathize or sympathize with the suffering of
with the downtrodden and that kind of stuff. Yeah. I mean, that's also a convenient line for a young Marxist, right? Like, you know what I mean? Like I sometimes you listen to comments like that or lines like that and you think, is that really how he felt, or is that just him putting on airs because he's a good showman too,
Well, he was a showman, and he did make kind of quite daft claims, sometimes things that were actually hugely offensive, maybe for the sensation of them. He claimed that he'd partaken in kind of cannibalistic rites and so on. And, that's somebody perhaps, like we talked about Sickert the other week, understanding the currency of shock,
Sure.
and of salaciousness and of being dark. To me, Rivera is a very dark character anyway. There doesn't need to be stories of cannibalism in there. There doesn't need to be stories of violence towards women. He's dark anyway. And with all these other things, and by the way, I'm not saying that the claims against him by women that he was violent and unpleasant, I don't dispute them necessarily. I don't know for sure, but I don't dispute them. Even without those things, I think there's something about Rivera that is very agitated. If you look at the detail I think
got. It's also, I think he's very much of his time. I mean, the first half of the 20th century, I mean, he was born in the 1880s or something.
Yeah.
The time that he lived in was the beginning of, the Russian Revolution in World War I, and the communist revolutions around the world, and the Great Depression in World War II. I mean, this was a time where human thought was trying to keep up with technological innovation, right? And right. The way we structure ourselves. But it's interesting because, like, whenever I feel like there are people in every mode, in every belief system, there are those people who put themselves up. And I think Rivera is a good example of one where, I'm this Marxist, I'm for the people, whatever it is. But in his daily life, he was a real jerk to, like, the people that he cared about most. He was. So it's interesting. It's like, do you really care about other people? Because you don't even seem like you care that much about your wives, because you're cheating on them and yelling at them and all these terrible things. So it's sort of just because you have certain political leanings doesn't make you a morally good person. You know what I mean?
No.
And just because you have other political leanings doesn't make you a morally bad person, which is
no. But you were mentioning the time in which he lived. His time in Paris was very, very nourishing for him as a young artist. And when he was there, the others he met, I mean, he, as most young painters seemed to be at the time, he was aware of Cézanne. He was influenced by Cézanne. He knew all the set that would have converged on Paris at that time. And actually, he took on board lots of the kind of Cubist principles. You can see that reflected in his painting. But he also had, I think, a couple of lovers who were Russian women who'd come from a kind of pre-Stalin,
pre-revolution
era. He was very wealthy, kind of culturally. He was so aware of everything around him. Sometimes, actually, Francis Bacon and Rivera have a kind of relationship in my mind always, in terms of their appetite. Their appetite for what they find, even when it's horror, or even when it's putrid, or even when it's difficult. And I'm never fooled really by the smooth quality of the paint in Rivera's work. As I said, there's this tremendous sense of darkness in what he does. And a writhing mass, it always makes me think of that lyric in Riders on the Storm, the Doors, the killer on the road, his mind is squirming like a toad, or something like that. And Rivera's mind, to me, squirms like a toad on the canvas or on the surfaces.
Yeah, it is interesting that somebody who is politically pro masses, he sees the masses as less as individuals and rather as a group, which I would always, if I felt that strongly in that direction, I would want to pull out individuals and show how they're more than just the way we label them as a group and that kind of thing.
Well, I mean, he did hope for this work. I think that it could be seen that people were working together. So although,
that's the funny thing about it. I didn't know anything about his politics when I saw it a few weeks ago. I just had never read about him. And so I am looking at it and I'm thinking, okay, this feels like a very 1930s idealized propagandistic version of what we can do together and how the Industrial Revolution can bring America forward, right? Because you can read it that way if you really want to. Of course, that's not what he was painting, but it also works. It was paid for by Edsel Ford, Henry Ford's son.
Yeah.
So it's not like it's coming out of, you know, some hippy dippy. It's literally coming from Ford paid for this, you know.
What's fascinating though is once they paid for it and it was completed, the Ford company actually invited people they knew would be offended by it to come and comment on it publicly.
Maybe because they were just that powerful that it didn't make a difference, you know?
Well, no, but also, I mean, there's a kind of sharpness to that, a cynicism in that as well, in that after they invited local clergy, for example, to come and pontificate upon this mural, particularly the Catholics and the Episcopalians, they hated it. They thought it was blasphemy.
You want to jump to the next one? Because the next one is the one that pisses people off.
Yeah. But, you know, after getting people to come and comment on this and say dreadful things about it publicly, of course, it meant that visitor numbers went through the roof. So there's a cynicism in all of this, I think. And it makes me question again, the initial point we were kind of circling is, you know, why would someone like Rivera be invited to the States to paint in this way at this point in history with his credentials, although as a very well-regarded painter, as somebody who politically is so in opposition.
Yeah. Well, I think it comes down to the curator, who was not American originally, right? Was from, he was German, right? Because he went back to, the curator who hired him went back and fought on the German side in World War I before coming back to America and getting all these jobs, you know, working in these places. So it's like, this is a guy coming from a country that was, you know, even in World War I was on the flip side of what Rivera was thinking about in Mexico at the time. So that's why I'm saying it was such a crazy hodgepodge of thought back then. I think you could get away with this kind of incongruity back then in a way that I don't know that you can get away with it politically now. I mean, did you have the little sign they put up in the 50s? It's at the bottom of the Wikipedia page. Did you read that? So apparently in the 1950s, when this was up, let me pull it up because it's really genius. During the 1950s, the DIA erected a sign above the entrance to the Rivera court that read, quote, "Rivera's politics and his publicity seeking are detestable, but let's get the record straight on what he did here. He came from Mexico to Detroit, thought our mass production industries and our technology wonderful and very exciting, painted them as one of the great achievements of the 20th century. This came after the debunking 20s, when our artists and writers found nothing worthwhile in America, and worst of all in America was the Middle West. Rivera saw and painted the significance of Detroit as a world city. If we are proud of this city's achievements, we should be proud of these paintings and not lose our heads over what Rivera was doing in Mexico today." This is a sign that was outside during McCarthy era, the anti-communist McCarthy era in America. It's like, it's so interesting. These paintings became, you know, this crazy tennis ball that just getting knocked around, paid for, you know, commissioned by, how clergy saw them, how politics saw them, how the viewers, the general public saw them. I mean, maybe in some ways, this is a great example of what art can do by, you know, sticking in the butt of society a pin that makes everyone jump and take a look at things differently, you know? And in the long run, you know, like people are looking, I guess religious people got very upset about this.
Yep. No, it wasn't just this detail though, Bill.
But this was one of the segments that people were particularly pissed about.
Yes.
But yeah, it's just so interesting. It's like, okay, so you're taking religious stuff and showing vaccinations, and you're also showing the good and the bad of technology, right? Like the next frame, can you just do the next frame for 1 second? is him showing the bad things that technology can do, like creating poison gases and bombs and whatnot. And so you also have this, in some ways, relatively balanced view of the double-edged sword of technology. Yes, it allows us to have all these great, amazing things, but it also turns people into worker ants. Oh, but it also saves people's lives through things like immunizations. It also takes people's lives through mass death during World War I and whatnot. It's I don't know. I find these paintings rather fascinating. And do you see the overpainting above between the two top guys there? It looks like he reshaped the head there.
Mm-hmm.
It's just interesting when you notice those things where you're like, oh, we changed something. Anyway, what were we going to say? Didn't mean to cut you off.
I can't remember.
Do you think that these paintings are as controversial as some people make them out to be?
Well, we're looking at this in 2022, and we transport ourselves back to 1933, and I'm looking at them with my 1933 experience.
When we didn't know where the Western world was going to be going, capitalism had failed us.
I don't know.
Socialism was on the rise. You don't know what?
I think it's a very dark piece of work. I think it is not the celebration that perhaps was hoped for.
Sure.
And there's almost just too much to talk about with them, really, because
like you said, you could write dissertations about these paintings.
Yeah, there's so many different layers of meaning in them. There's countless symbols, and symbols from different cultural contexts. We said already, Rivera was kind of obsessed really with his Jewish heritage. He was quite.
But there's also all this Mexican stuff in there too.
But
right?
There's lots of Aztec stuff. There's lots
iconography,
of that would play into notions of Catholicism and the church, and it's exhausting.
But it's funny because, like, in some ways, you could say that's really successful, then, right?
I don't think it's not my place to dispute the success or not of the painting broadly. I
don't mean in like a moral sense, but I just mean there's a lot in this and a lot of ways to look at it, and that conversation starting ability of it says a lot for the power of the work, I think.
With this, I think I find it quite difficult to actually separate what I know of Rivera, because I've always come to Rivera through Kahlo, right? And I've loathed him wholeheartedly. And sometimes it's quite difficult to see afresh, this idea.
Do you like her and her work, or her work, or both, or neither? How do you feel about Frida Kahlo?
It's not a like, it's a profound respect.
Okay.
Whereas I don't think I have much respect for Rivera. That's not true. I mean, I've said already this idea about kind of like, a kind of respect for artists. Artists are sharing a vision with the world. And this is a commission. You can't forget that. This isn't just the artist painting in his studio. His team of assistants and he were given a task.
Apparently they did it very quickly too. It was like over like 6 or 8 months or something, like some crazy short span of time. I mean, to do all the studies and actually paint it. It's funny because there was a big Frida Kahlo exhibition at the Brooklyn Museum a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
And it had it showed some of her work, but also a lot of behind the scenes stuff and a lot of, stuff about her health and her back braces and all kinds of, crazy personal stuff. And I've never been a particular fan of her art, but it made me actually like her less than I did before, because it felt like a lot of her fame had more to do with her celebrity than it did her work. Does that make sense? Like how people felt about her personally, or how she was seen personally as an individual, not what she actually made. And it felt like the beginning of part of what I don't like of the direction of art, in my opinion, has gone over the years since then, is that a lot of times it's as much about the person as it is what they made. And like, I don't care about the person. I'm not a big celebrity person. In fact, I despise celebrity in general. So like when I see that, I'm like, this is like proto celebrity, and I don't like that. While this guy may have been a real jerk to her and all the other people in his life, I do like this work separated from the artist. I think it's beautiful painting. So, and by the way, it also looks very almost like not comic booky, but just sort of the three-dimensionality and stuff of the machines.
Oh gosh, there's loads of stuff in this. I mean, you could say that it is a huge, like a precursor to the fantasy art that would have come out of the 40s and 50s. You could say, someone like H.R. Geiger, for example, and all the alien stuff, was probably looking at this. We also, its roots are in a kind of a new age of painting, of modernist painting. It has informed lots of other things, of course, but is it easy for me to separate him from it? Not really. And the thing that I love about it, though, is I love how interesting it is that anyone should ask Rivera to paint this. What is actually the purpose of it? Yes, I can read about the purpose of it, but I mean, sort of as an inquiry, really, what is the purpose of this? It's not as obvious as it might seem. It isn't just a celebration of Detroit at the pinnacle of its power in the automotive industry. It's not just about the fact that the workers are so vital to this giant juggernaut of cultural movement because of commerce and industry. It's not just that. There's something else in this. Like, why has he painted this? Why was it him? Why? That's what
I don't think they said they wanted something that spoke to the industry of the city. They didn't, as far as I know, they did not tell him what he had to paint. Who
is it for?
I think this is self-aggrandizement.
Right. For?
I think this is a remnant of, Gilded Age thinking and great men's society, right?
Yeah.
I think this is a pillar, this is a monument to what one great man, in this case Henry Ford, can change the world. And this is the sort of last of, it's the real transition period, right, between the turn of the century industrialization of the world, and now we're in the Depression. We have World War II coming, where things are looked at very differently. This is like a last gasp of, let's lock this down before things change too much. And then in some ways, maybe by getting somebody like him to paint it, you can you can't be accused of having two rose colored. Look, we invited this Marxist to come do it, and he still painted this beautiful, amazing thing of how great our technology was. I mean, that's basically what the thing I read from the 50s was saying, right? It was so good, even he was swept away. It's like bringing in your enemy to write your book quote.
But there's I don't want to believe this really about it, but it's all quite tokenistic.
Yeah. This one's particularly creepy to me. This is the pharmaceutical industry, I think. There's something about the bean counter in the middle that's creeps me out. Talk about a guy who looks like he's from a weird. Wait, who's the guy? Who's the guy who made the Monty Python guy who did Brazil and Terry Gilliam? It's got a very Terry Gilliam kind of feel to it.
Yeah, all of this does again. But, you know, that's then perhaps where this is future calling. It's casting itself out into the future very easily. There's so much for popular culture to take from these murals.
It's really like I mean, it really is a milestone in art in some ways, just because it's like you were saying, it's like it came from such obvious roots, but like so many things go through this to go out to where we are today, both in serious art and more, you know, general art. And just the sort of the scale and the grotesqueness of some of it, and the complications and the post-apocalyptic kind of, you know, post-industrial feel of it all. It's like it feels like we're still living in this world somehow. Like this is proto-modern.
We are. And, you know, if you look even back at, you know, the Christ-like baby getting the vaccine, does this not show us that our concerns now have been our concerns always? Our fears are the same, regardless of whether we're alive in 1933 or 2022. I would hazard a guess that if I were to wake up and I was in 1533, the kind of the makeup of my fear would be different, but the scaffold itself would be the same. Humans being human have always been human.
Sure. But if you looked at this, if you looked up Diego Rivera on Wikipedia, what you found out was that he married his high school sweetheart. And yes, he was a Marxist who lived in Mexico, but he was a pretty boring guy who didn't have a lot of friends and just painted really amazing stuff. Would you look at this differently than you do?
Maybe.
I mean,
I would still be very interested in the personal politics of the painter. Because inevitably, though it's a commission, you know, we have often talked about artists who've managed to shoehorn in a little bit of their own agenda. What is Rivera's agenda? Is it simply that he's getting paid and that he has this enormous platform from which to showcase his fabulous talent? Was there something else profound and of deep importance to him politically to make this painting? Part of me hopes so, because it gives it a kind of integrity that's about the painter as much as the commission itself. But I don't know if it is that. I don't know.
Yeah, but you know what? If you're just looking at these paintings for 10 minutes as you're walking through there, you're a normal person, not somebody who's weird and crazy as obsessive like we are. I mean, you could look up and you see the kid getting vaccinated, and you can see the bombs getting made, and you can see the workers toiling. But you really can just see this as an ad for the greatest things about, you know, turn of the century America.
So it's a big billboard.
Yeah, essentially a billboard that you know has been there for 90 years.
But what is it really advertising, Bill?
It's advertising a dream. I think the problem is that, and I spent time today with the chief of staff of the mayor of New York, because I was taking her picture. We were talking a little bit, and I came away with it just thinking, you know, every system, every way of thinking, whether Diego Rivera politically got his dream and we could have some socialist utopia, of course, we all realize that there's no such thing as a socialist utopia, in the same way as there's no such thing as a capitalist utopia or a fascist utopia, that humans be humans be humans, as you said. And humans are always going to screw up the best laid plans of the smart political people. And that we dream of perfection, but what we get is human, you know? And that is, I think that that's true as much now as it was in 1932. But, you know, I didn't know about these, and I am glad that I now know about these, because I think they are a profound piece of work. I mean, if you were an artist and this was all that was left of your legacy, it would be a pretty darn good legacy.
Wow. You know, is that what this is then? I
think everyone wants a legacy.
Hope for immortality.
Sure. I mean, I think that that's what Edsel Ford was trying to do for his father. I think that's what Rivera was trying to do for himself.
So we're looking at a giant visual of death fear on lots of different levels and from lots of different people colliding in one.
Everything anybody ever does in life is death fear. People have children because they have fear of death. You know, people strive because they have fear of death. It's all the same thing. I don't know. I find it interesting. These are good. I like these. As much as the guy sounds like a real piece of work.
Yeah, I think he really was.
I think he made he's really good at this. There's that whole story about the one at Rockefeller Center too, which I'm sure you've read about.
Tell me.
We painted this thing and Lenin was in it and Marx was in it or something. And they told him to remove Lenin and he said no, but he had already gotten paid. And so they ended up destroying it. And there was only black and white pictures of it remaining. And so he repainted it down in Mexico somewhere. But then some people say that it wasn't destroyed. It was just painted over and it might still be there.
Do you know, today or yesterday, they found another Van Gogh
I saw a self-portrait underpainting. Yeah.
Yeah. I do like it when things like this are discovered. Imagine.
I feel like somebody should go through Rockefeller Center and go find this and do one of those x-ray things and see if it's actually underneath. That'd be kind of cool.
You should champion it, Bill. You should get a community behind you. March over the bridge.
I don't have nearly enough clout or money to make that happen, but I'll see what I can do just for you.
Anyway, very interesting. Thanks, Bill.
Thank you, Sandi.